Peace and Conflict Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Tech Policy Institute at the Brooks School of Policy. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Anatoly Levshin is a postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also the director's fellow with the Reimagining World Order Research Community at Princeton University, which he co-curated with its director, John Eikenberry. He's working on 2 book projects. One explores the risks and benefits of national security applications of artificial intelligence. It's tentatively entitled The Geopolitics of Digital Oracles. They spoke about that, I think, earlier today at the Brooks School, but that's actually his 2nd book project. Right now, we're about to hear about his 1st book project entitled Bounding War, Rules of Neutralization, Demilitarization, and Non-Aggression, and the Institutional Logic of Prohibitions on Militarized Bargaining. And it investigates the history and theory of the rules of neutralization, demilitarization, and non-aggression as instruments for the bounding of war in the international system. So we're really looking forward to your talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levshin.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Rebecca. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today and to be able to share this book project with you. The book project is coming together. It's sort of in the final stages at this point. But if you feel that there is anything fundamentally wrong with the argument, with the analysis, or if you think there is something fundamentally right that needs to be reinforced, now is the time to voice those opinions, and I can incorporate it into the book. I'd be happy to give you credit for those observations. Let me also just give you a kind of flag before I dive into the discussion itself. As I'm sure you've seen from the chapter that was circulated, if you read that, or you will see from the talk if you haven't read the chapter, this project treads on familiar ground. It's ground that is deeply familiar historically to students of international relations, deeply familiar theoretically also, and therefore it might seem presumptuous of me to try to offer you something by way of novel interpretation of history, of such deeply, intimately familiar moments as the origins of the League of Nations, or to say something novel about something that is so familiar as militarized bargaining in the international system. However, my promise to you today is that by the end of this talk, I hope you will be able to agree with the words of the poet, that the end of our exploring is to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. That is my promise to you, and I hope you will find yourself not disappointed. So with that, let's dive in. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with that observation, a quintessentially realist observation about international politics, that under anarchy, in the absence of a central authority, the possibility of war between states fundamentally conditions interstate relations, possibilities for cooperation, and the trajectory of the evolution of international order. That much is very well known. Less well appreciated is the fact that states routinely and deliberately regulate that possibility by treaty. There are 3 reasonably well-known examples of this, of course. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Covenant of the League of Nations. Here in the slide, you see what's known as the Celestial Sphere, honoring Woodrow Wilson's role in the founding of the League of Nations. You can find it in the grounds of the Palais des Nations in Geneva, the second home of the League of Nations and the European headquarters of the United Nations today. And of course, you're also familiar, I'm sure, with the Charter of the United Nations. You might not realize, however, that these examples are merely the tip of an iceberg. That this practice stretches far in history, both to antiquity, through the Middle Ages, and into modernity, and is almost omnipresent these days. Let me chart first for you the universe of cases here. the three big rules, prohibitions on militarized bargaining that I will be discussing today are rules of neutralization, demilitarization, and non-aggression. Neutralization is a commitment by which a state is prevented from entering into alliances with another state or from waging war on other states. Demilitarization is a commitment by which a particular piece of territory is prohibited from being used for the generation or projection of military power. And finally, non-aggression is a symmetric commitment between states whereby they agree to renounce the use of military force against one another. Now, non-aggression commitments you can find either as standalone commitments, we usually call that just non-aggression pacts, or you can find them embedded in systems that include an obligation of mutual defense. And when that obligation of mutual defense is coupled with exclusive membership, we call that composite institutional form collective defense. When it's coupled to an inclusive membership rule, we call that composite institutional form collective security. I'm less interested today in the mutual defense obligation that you find in these two institutional forms. I think that's reasonably well understood. My focus in discussing these examples here will be specifically on the non-aggression commitment that you find embedded in them, and also in the neutralization and demilitarization commitments in the other cases. Now, these commitments are exceptionally interesting. Why? Because they entail tremendous costs for the states that enter into them. Two types of costs specifically. First are the sovereignty costs. The states that enter into prohibitions on militarized bargaining agree voluntarily to refrain from using militarized bargaining as an instrument of leverage. They voluntarily, ladies and gentlemen, restrict their compétence de guerre, the right of war, surrendering that primordial aspect of sovereignty. But they also incur tremendous autonomy costs because enforcing the prohibitions indiscriminately against rogue powers requires them to forego the options of either remaining neutral in a dispute when a prohibition is violated or bandwagoning with the aggressor. And the fact that you have these costs, these substantial costs, when contrasted with the routine use of these instruments by great powers and small states throughout history, gives rise to the core question of the book project. Why would any state voluntarily bind itself to a rule of prohibition which can only diminish its right and freedom to exercise military power arbitrarily? Let me quickly preview my argument for you. In the book, I argue that states use these commitments to diminish the risk of entanglement in what I call disputes characterized by runaway escalation trajectories. I will define this term carefully in due course. For the moment, all I want you to take away from this is that these are disputes that have an internal self-reinforcing quality to them. These are disputes that do not terminate at a particular point of maximum intensity or geographical scope. Once you get into a dispute like that, it's like quicksand. It takes on a life of its own and spirals seemingly out of the control of the states that initiate it. And when faced with the possibility of a dispute like that, that's when states agree to enter into these binding commitments, putting guardrails against the possibility of entanglement in runaway escalation, even if they're rivals, even if they're otherwise prepared to go to war against one another. Now, I will show to you that this argument is at work not just in a single case, but across the whole universe of these prohibitions. It's a unified logic, ladies and gentlemen. And I will further show to you how this logic enables fresh, original interpretations of some of the most familiar episodes in international history. And my focus in the talk today will be on the origins of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and specifically its famous, or depending on your point of view, infamous Article 10, the non-aggression guarantee article. Quick outline of the talk. I will start by defining my terms more precisely. I will offer you some descriptive empirics just to show how the practice of prohibitions on militarized bargaining manifests in history. I will try to deepen for you the sense of why existing explanations aren't quite enough to make sense of this practice, then offer my theory, and then offer the evidence in support of the theory, both quantitative and qualitative. So let me start by defining key terms. Militarized bargaining. I think this is fairly standard definition here. I'm just making terms explicit to make sure we're all on the same page. By this, I will understand simply a state's use of military power or threat of its use in disputes with other states. And working on this definition, I propose to define prohibitions on militarized bargaining as a legal pledge, an explicit pledge, incorporated in treaty or some other instrument, such as, for example, a resolution of the United Nations Security Council, by which one group of states, I will call them the enforcer states, explicitly undertake to restrict the ability of another group of states, I call them the subject states, to engage in militarized bargaining, wholly or partially. What does that mean? How does this actually play out in history? You want to keep in mind these three dimensions of institutional design variation when it comes to crafting these prohibitions. The first dimension is membership. Who is allowed to be the enforcer? Is the membership open in principle to the whole of the international system like it is with collective security, the League of Nations, the United Nations? Or is it restricted, perhaps to a club of the great powers, as in the case of the Concert of Europe, neutralizing Belgium? Another dimension you want to keep in mind is coverage. Who is the prohibition being applied to, or what? Is it, for example, a piece of territory that is getting demilitarized? Is it a narrow strip of territory under the control of a sovereign state, as in the case of the Rhineland in the wake of the First World War? Or is it unclaimed virgin territory, as in the case of the whole of Antarctica being demilitarized by the United Nations? Or is it indeed the whole of the international system, as with the non-aggression commitment under the United Nations Charter? The final dimension of variation that you want to keep in mind is the prescriptive rule itself. What is the rule accomplishing the prohibition? Is it the rule of neutralization, demilitarization, or the prohibition on aggressive war? And when you think about how these three dimensions come together, these are the most frequent combinations that you see across the past 2 centuries. Rules of neutralization and demilitarization generally are enacted by smaller clubs of states, usually the great powers, but not always. If you think about the neutralization of Honduras, that's an example of smaller states coming together to accomplish neutralization. And non-aggression is usually accomplished by regional groups of states, or indeed the international community as a whole coming together. Now, to give you a clearer sense of how this practice of prohibitions and militarized bargaining manifests in history, I assembled an original data set of these commitments, where I focus specifically on commitments involving at least 3 enforcer states. So I will call these multilateral commitments purely in Robert Cohen's quantitative sense of multilateralism, not John Ruggie's qualitative multilateralism. Leave that to the side. So these 3 enforcer states, and these are commitments that were concluded over the past 2 centuries. This data set was assembled primarily from the scholarly literature, the Soviet literature on international law, and some of the late Nazi jurisprudence on international law was particularly helpful as a source of references cataloging these commitments. But then there are also some published data sets in which the rule of non-aggression is covered. And then, of course, there are the texts of treaties that you can find in databases collected by the League of Nations and the United Nations. When you pull all of that information together, these are the aggregate pictures that you get. First, we can take a look at the number of prohibitions that are legally active at a point in time. Legally active, meaning they're in force. The states that assume these obligations haven't yet renounced them formally, as in the case, for example, of Hitler denouncing the demilitarization of the Rhineland and marching his troops there, or in the case of Russia renouncing the demilitarization of its Black Sea coast and reclaiming it for use for military naval bases. These are the numbers that you see in the first half of the long 19th century, suggesting a reasonably constant trend initially, a slight increase over the interwar period, and then an explosion over the course of the post-war period. What's driving that? We can disaggregate the trends in several ways. First, by the actual prescriptive rule being used. This is quite fascinating, ladies and gentlemen. You see here that initially, and throughout most of the long 19th century indeed, the 2 rules that are the go-tos in the repertoire of the great powers, especially, are neutralization and demilitarization. There's only a single example of non-aggression prior to the League of Nations, and that's the German Confederation, the organization that is dissolved during the Wars of Unification with Prussia's defeat of Austria. But with the League of Nations inaugurating a new trend, today, non-aggression is the modal prohibition that states use. We can also look at the historical context in which these prohibitions were created. You can see that initially, they're part of the great bargains that settle major wars, especially the Vienna settlement that concluded the Napoleonic Wars. But there is an interesting trend that begins to develop by the middle of the long 19th century, which is the use of these prohibitions in peacetime to stabilize changing situations, especially with the emergence of new states out of the declining Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. And then the final innovation, which we find with the Cold War, the use of these agreements, or these commitments specifically in armistice agreements before the formal conclusion of the peace. We can also look at the membership trends, just to see how frequent and common these commitments are in history. You can see here that the average number of enforcer states and subject states stayed roughly constant in absolute terms across the long 19th century, and then began to grow over the course of the 20th century. And the gray bands that you see here plot the standard deviations in memberships across active commitments. But this picture here is a little bit misleading because it doesn't account for the growth of the international system, especially due to decolonization. What happens once we adjust for that? A much more constant trend emerges. Yes, there is more experimentation in the interwar period. That was a period of, in fact, tremendous creativity and experimentation when it comes to prohibitions and militarized bargaining. But outside of it, we see some volatility, but it's much more constrained now. And this picture, ladies and gentlemen, I think conveys the sense of just how routine and how constant the use of these commitments has been over the past 2 centuries. And so now with this historical sense established of the routine use of prohibitions and militarized bargaining, I want to take you back to the core research question of the project. Given that these commitments are so routine, but that they also entail such enormous sovereignty and autonomy costs, why do states use them? There is a small literature devoted to these institutional forms. It is a very small literature indeed, by the standards even of the most niche literatures in international relations. This is almost an exhaustive bibliography. There are more sources on collective security than I was able to put on the slide here, but for the other commitments, very, very sparse. And when you look across this literature and try to tease out theoretical intuitions, we can basically put these theoretical intuitions under a couple of familiar rubrics. And these are the alternative explanations that are available to us right away. And the first one, of course, is the null hypothesis of cheap talk. This is perhaps the most obvious hypothesis. Why would states assume these costs if they're so heavy indeed? The obvious answer is the costs are meaningless. States talk the talk of prohibitions and militarized bargaining, but they do not walk the walk. And indeed, there are examples of this when we know from the historical record, and it's widely known indeed, that the prohibition was assumed cynically. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was exactly that, ladies and gentlemen, for the United States. France wants a binding security commitment. The United States weasels out by proposing a broad multilateral settlement instead. France has no choice but to accept to avoid humiliation. But then there are a couple of alternative hypotheses to consider. And the first group of these hypotheses, despite variation in the causal mechanisms, basically says that there are structural discontinuities. Something happens in the nature of industrial modernity that changes the way that states engage with military power. The realist logics of old no longer hold, or they don't quite hold in the same way as they used to. Why? Some people say it's because the greater destructiveness of industrial warfare compared to pre-industrial warfare, the costs of using military power are now so prohibitive. Maybe it's the emergence of a new type of regime, liberal democracies specifically, that have a qualitatively different approach to the use of military force. Or maybe it's the emergence of transnational anti-war solidarities driven especially by the budding peace movement. In the Anglosphere, it is the Quakers who pioneer this, but there are separate streams feeding into this development, especially with the use of arbitration in the early 19th century in Latin America. Another alternative hypothesis says that it's less about the expression of a nascent solidarity and more about norm entrepreneurs trying to socialize statesmen and policymakers into appropriate standards of behavior. The norms are not there yet on this explanation, but the norm entrepreneurs put these prohibitions forward in order to socialize people into appropriate behavior. And finally, we have the Cohen regime theory explanation, which is that these tools are simply means of lubricating the bargaining process. And the familiar logics kick in here. There are ways of reducing information asymmetries, overcoming commitment problems, reducing transaction costs, and all of that good familiar stuff. That's a lot. That's a lot to play with. Why is this not enough? The fundamental problem is what I call the problem of indeterminacy, and the existing explanations can't overcome it. Take a look, ladies and gentlemen, at this repertoire of commitments that states can assume in order to bound war, to put limits on war. They can, for example, delineate regions in which they can come to a clash through spheres of influence. Completely informal, no formal costs necessary. They can enact commitments, which I call permissive rules, where they don't forgo the use of war, but they put guardrails on the use of war first. Certain conditions have to be met before force can be used. Think, for example, here of cooling off periods, pioneered by William Jennings Bryan, Wilson's first Secretary of State in the North American context. In the South American context, they're pioneered in 1848 in a mediation agreement between the United States and Mexico. If you decide to go for prescriptive rules where prohibitions on the use of force are put in place, you can, of course, stick with prohibiting particular arms systems. It's only when you get to prohibitions on militarized bargaining that the right of war itself gets truncated. What we want is an explanation that gets us to that trajectory specifically. Not spheres of influence, not arbitration, not cooling off, not prescriptive arms control. We want specifically prohibitions on militarized bargaining. So what's the problem? The problem is that all the alternative explanations that I've offered you so far, they cannot differentiate between these commitments. From the standpoint of those alternative explanations, these commitments are all substitutes. All of these commitments can reduce information asymmetries. They can help states avoid commitment problems. They can help socialize statesmen into appropriate norms of behavior. They're compatible with the urge that liberal democracies might have for a different international system. Those explanations treat this whole repertoire as so many substitutes, in other words. But here's the puzzle then. If these are all substitutes, why would any state ever go for the more expensive among a range of substitutes? Prohibitions on militarized bargaining, because they entail a renunciation of the right of war, partially or wholly, entail the largest sovereignty and autonomy costs across all of these commitments, conditioning on membership and coverage. So why would you ever go for the more expensive among a range of substitutes? In order to make sense of this puzzle, we need to try to dig into exactly how those alternative logics actually induce a preference for the bounding of war in the first place. And my argument to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the alternatives that I've given you so far, the regime theory alternative, the constructivist alternative, the industrial modernity discontinuities alternative, the reason that they all work in suggesting a general preference for the bounding of war is that they presuppose a certain flux of conflict in the international system, violating underlying sensitivities charted by those alternatives. Why would liberal states want to restrict the right of war? Because there is an expectation of a flux of violence that can threaten these liberal states. So they need to guard against it. Why do we need to enact a formal rule to socialize elites into an anti-war behavior? It's because there is an expectation of a flux of violence specifically that threatens to undermine those solidarities. The implicit assumption, which when unarticulated, not fleshed out in those explanations about the scope of violence, when we make it more precise and we try to vary that flux of violence, is exactly what gets us to a determinate, precise explanation of why states would want to use prohibitions on militarized bargaining exactly. And in order to make that case to you, I need to introduce a new concept. what I call escalation trajectories. This is a way for us to understand states' expectations about the flux of violence in the international system. This is going to be the unit of analysis. And by an escalation trajectory, I propose to understand specifically longitudinal changes over time in militarized disputes, geographical scope, I will colloquially just call this horizontal escalation, and the intensity of competition. This is the vertical escalation dimension. Now, from a purely descriptive statistics standpoint, we can actually map these two dimensions of variation. And just to give you a sense of how they look like in history, this is, for example, a graph that shows the horizontal escalation trajectories of all the interstate wars that occurred over the past 2 centuries. What I did on this plot is I standardized the duration of the wars, and then I standardized also their expansion across the international system. And so you can see here how the different wars evolved over time as a function of their duration. We can't quite prepare a similar plot for the vertical escalation dimension because we don't have intensities, whether measured as resources invested or combat fatalities, developing over time, but we can correlate the vertical dimension with the horizontal dimension at their maximal points. And when we do that, we see that there is a strong correlation at play between these two dimensions, which suggests a kind of a similar trajectory over time, even if the functional forms are not exactly the same. What these descriptive plots don't fully tell you, however, is how the statesmen who were involved in these disputes felt about those escalation trajectories as they experienced them, as they anticipated them. And here, a critical distinction is between what I call steady escalation trajectories and runaway escalation trajectories. A steady escalation trajectory is a trajectory that endogenously, by virtue of the underlying strategic logic of the dispute, converges to a particular point of termination. More precisely, this means there is a maximum point of intensity for both the vertical and the horizontal dimension of the escalation trajectory, which is defined by the internal strategic logic of the dispute. It stays bounded, it stays localized. A runaway escalation trajectory is a trajectory that does not have any such endogenous point of termination. That doesn't mean it's a dispute without end. It just means it doesn't have a logic of termination built into the dispute. And when such disputes terminate, it's due to an exogenous influence, disrupting the conflict dynamic. Think of Russia in the First World War collapsing in a revolution. Think of Germany being unable to continue prosecuting the war because they run out of fuel and they're consumed also in a much milder revolution. Runaway escalation trajectories create unique incentives for states to cooperate precisely in a way that motivates the creation of prohibitions on militarized bargaining. And this takes me to the core of my theory. It is precisely when statesmen expect entanglement in a dispute which doesn't have an endogenous point of termination in its internal strategic logic, when they see this dispute on their strategic horizon, that they come together, even as rivals, in order to put guardrails against the possibility of such entanglement. Let's flesh out exactly how this argument plays out in the historical record with 3 observable implications. The first observable implication tells us what we should actually expect to see in the historical record itself, in the archival evidence, if we think that the expectation of runaway escalation is indeed connected to the use of these prohibitions. How should policymakers express that expectation? They express it, ladies and gentlemen, as a sense of qualitative uncertainty about the escalation trajectory. Qualitative uncertainty, not in the sense of calculable risk, but in the sense that Frank Knight, the great economist, pioneered, and that Keynes adopted later also. This is incalculable uncertainty. Yes, risk is the ability to reduce uncertainty down to specific probability distributions, qualitative certainty almost. Qualitative uncertainty is the inability to even assign any probabilities whatsoever, a complete inability to tell how the process is going to unfold. We should see that kind of qualitative uncertainty in the record. And when we see that kind of qualitative uncertainty in the historical record, the next thing that we want to be on the lookout for is how the statesmen consider the dispute emerging and entangling them. Is the entanglement contingent or is the entanglement inevitable? If the entanglement is something that they see on the horizon, but they think they can just avoid by bypassing it altogether, they're not going to enact any commitments whatsoever. We see that, for example, when the Greek wars for independence break out, there is fear in Britain that Russia, due to its historical claim as the defender of the Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, would get involved in that dispute, pitting itself against British claims in the region, in effect. The British worries are answered by the Russian Foreign Minister Karl von Nesselrode's dispatch to London, where he says, why would we ever do this when there is no limit, he puts it, to how that confrontation would escalate. There is a clear sense, in other words, in Nesselrode's dispatch, that a confrontation of that sort would not be a confrontation that either Russia or Britain would be able to control. But it's not a confrontation that either of them is seeking, and therefore they can just sidestep it altogether, no problems at all. It's a different case entirely when you see such a confrontation emerging on the horizon and you don't think you'd be able to escape it, as was in the case, for example, with Belgium declaring its independence from the Netherlands and provoking a major confrontation between France seeking to annex Belgium and the other great powers of the concert of Europe. In that kind of a case, a formal commitment is necessary as a circuit breaker to kick states out of a runaway escalation trajectory. And of course, it is the distribution of the risk of entanglement in disputes characterized by a runaway escalation trajectory, the topography in network analysis lingo of this risk, which shapes the preferences for different designs of these commitments. Why are some of these commitments local? Because the anticipated distribution of the risk is localized. Why are some of them more global? Because there's uncertainty about the overall distribution of the risk in the international system. This will be very important as we dive into the League of Nations case study. And let me first just introduce the methodological toolkit of the book project for you. There are both quantitative and qualitative components to the book project. The quantitative component primarily relies on survival analysis. The Cox proportional hazards model is the workhorse here. It suits the quantitative requirements of the analysis because it traces time to an event. In this case, the event is the enactment of a prohibition on militarized bargaining. And I'm going to use dynamic systems analysis in order to develop a precise measure of runaway escalation and show you that indeed runaway escalation explains, in a statistically significant way, states' use of these prohibitions across that whole universe that I charted for you. And then there is a qualitative component which works with case studies in order to interrogate the institutional imaginations of the founders of these commitments, to demonstrate that the logic is at play, not just at the aggregate statistical level, but in the imaginations of the actual founders themselves. So let me just very quickly go through the quantitative data. I don't want to focus on this too much, but I just want to give you a sense. I want to persuade you that there is evidence at the aggregate level. The workhorse, as I said, is the Cox proportional hazards model, and I use sparse solutions for this model, which I compute with an elastic net regularizer, and it's computed on the dyadic data from all the familiar data sets to ensure that adequate controls are in place. On the qualitative, very quickly, just on the measure first, the measure of runaway escalation that I will be using. This is a little bit technical, and I don't want to linger on this too much, but just to give you a sense of exactly what I'm using, to be completely transparent and honest with you. My measure of runaway escalation is what's known as the largest Lyapunov exponent applied to the horizontal trajectories of interstate wars. The largest Lyapunov exponent in dynamic systems analysis is a way of mathematically, unambiguously identifying whether a project basically has a steady quality to it or a runaway quality to it in a dynamic systems context. The reason this measure is so perfect is because there is an inductive algorithm for calculating it without knowing the underlying function driving the process. So you can basically apply this measure to a particular war, and it gives you a binary variable telling you whether the time series has a runaway quality or a steady quality. And that's what I plug into the Cox model. That's the result that you're going to see in a moment. On the case studies, these case studies have now been completed. I'm happy to talk about all of these cases in the Q&A, but I will focus on the League of Nations in the discussion specifically. There are more cases that are mentioned in the précis that was circulated with the chapter. Those cases are not yet finished, but I'm happy to talk about them also. Let me just very quickly give you the Cox results before diving into the case study. I've included some important confounders here, but this is the variable that you want to take a look at. Runaway escalation measured as the largest Lyapunov exponent of the horizontal escalation trajectories. This number here is what you want to focus your attention on. As I'm sure you know, the way to interpret the coefficient is this number here. When the coefficient is exponentiated, it gives you the percentage by which the likelihood of a commit in the outcome, in this case is states enacting prohibitions and militarized bargaining, is increased for states that are exposed to this coefficient. And here you can see that if a state experiences runaway escalation, then it's more likely to enter into a prohibition and militarized bargaining imminently by over 51% relative to a state that does not experience runaway escalation. And you can see this is a very strong effect. It compares favorably with some of the other obvious confounders. With this out of the way, unless there are questions specifically on this, let me move to the case study. This is kind of the really nice, exciting part of the talk. The League of Nations, and as a Princetonian, it gives me great pleasure to talk about Woodrow Wilson, so it is quite lovely. We'll start with Article 10. Just as a reminder, if you don't remember it, which probably is for the best, this is ancient history at this point. Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. The members of the League undertake to respect and preserve, as against external aggression, territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. It's a composite agreement. Yes, there is a mutual defense obligation here. Yes, but it's a mutual defense obligation that sits on top of a non-aggression commitment. The two are wedded together. And the question that I want to address in this case study is, why is there a non-aggression commitment here in the first place? Now, many historians don't really find this commitment particularly troublesome, or political scientists for that matter, because they don't consider the whole universe of repertoires that's available to states for the bounding of war. But we here in this room, we consider this problem. We consider the difficulty that indeterminacy poses to existing explanations. And there are some historians who've grappled with the problem of indeterminacy also. And for them, Article 10 poses a big historical puzzle. Take a look, for example, at Warren Kewell, a great American historian of the British and American peace movements. His biography of Hamilton Holt, who was a confidant of Woodrow Wilson, is unrivaled. And Kewell, bringing all of his expertise about this episode to bear on the question, says there is no evidence to explain why Woodrow Wilson decided to insist on this commitment. It makes no sense, he says. His philosophy seemed to require no such guarantee. It feels to Kewell completely ad hoc. He's at a loss for why this commitment was even necessary. Martin Keatle, the great British historian of the early British peace movement and the Quakers specifically, goes even further. The commitment makes so little sense that, in fact, Wilson himself must have been confused about the commitment. There's no other explanation. I will show you now how the theory of runaway escalation can make sense of this puzzle. And I will do that by focusing on three people in particular. The two people that are really necessary for this case study are, of course, the man himself and also his British counterpart, Lord Robert Cecil, later Viscount Cecil of Chelwood, who was the British eminence grise, the great cardinal of British League of Nations policy at the Paris Peace Conference. This man here is not exactly relevant to the case study, except that one of the last premiers of the Russian Empire, he in fact proposed the first known blueprint for a collective security system, a global non-aggression pact, that's been largely lost to history. And it's a document that's not been analyzed by historians or political scientists before. And because of the temporal proximity and the fact that it bears on the observable implications of the theory, I want to share it with you today. I've only seen it ever discussed before by Alexander Solzhenitsyn very briefly in his monumental novel, The Red Wheel. So you're seeing it here almost for the first time. It's in 1911, in May 1911, just months before he's assassinated, that Stolypin drafts this blueprint. Does the logic comport with the logic that I've articulated for you? The document itself is typed up by his secretary, and the language is ambiguous. Here is the most relevant part of the language, where Stolypin, speaking through his secretary, narrates for us the motivation. This motivation that you see here in this document is something that is quite ambiguous. I understand that. It's admittedly open to alternative interpretations. Familiar chain gang dynamics and alliances are as compatible with this as the story of runaway escalation. This is not an unambiguous piece of evidence, but it is an important historical piece of evidence that offers some minimal support for my theory. Moving from the Stolypin story, which is more of a historical artifact than a core element of the case study itself, to Woodrow Wilson is when things get really interesting. It is in 1914, in the first month of the First World War, that Wilson articulates his vision for what would eventually become Article 10 of the Covenant. This is a very famous document, ladies and gentlemen. This is not Wilson himself. This is his brother-in-law. Wilson's wife, incidentally, just died. She just passed away several weeks before this moment. Wilson is still in mourning. He's not the one writing the document, but his brother-in-law takes some notes. They're kept in the Princeton archives. You can see them yourselves. And then toward the end of the war, he types the whole thing up. And this is his retelling of a conversation that he has with Wilson in that moment. And this is the critical sentence. Wilson tells Stockton Axon, his brother-in-law, an attack in any quarter of the world is an attack on the equilibrium of the world, and the safety of the world demands such a combination of the forces of the nations as would maintain peace. This is, again, a forgivingly ambiguous formulation. Many historians and political scientists, including the great Innes Claude, have taken this to mean a bunch of different things. However, you can already see how this is at least compatible with the idea of runaway escalation. But this is the document that is basically the start and end of any explanation that you find with serious historians for why Woodrow Wilson wanted Article 10. We can go deeper. Wilson himself was very prolix, trying to justify his commitment on Article 10 to basically anyone who would listen. This is a letter from him to the then editor of the New Statesman, in which he says, impressed by how the First World War exploded out of all control, that there is something about this war that almost serves as an archetype of the wars of the future, that they're going to have a similar runaway quality to them. But critically for Wilson, he is not saying that every war is going to have that quality. Notice what he's saying here. There is uncertainty. He doesn't know which ones will have that quality in the future and which ones will not. And therefore, it's not possible for him to do what the concert did with Belgium, neutralizing a specific hotspot. He has to, in effect, neutralize the whole of the international system to extinguish the flame of runaway escalation. Unable to pin down the exact location of the hotspots that might explode in this way, as opposed to those which might not. And that sense of epistemic uncertainty pervades his writings completely. This is another fascinating document. This is from an interview that Wilson's brother-in-law did with Wilson's confidant and later biographer, Ray Stannard Baker, who followed Wilson closely in Paris, where Stockton Axon confesses that Wilson was obsessed, basically, with this sense of uncertainty, qualitative uncertainty, unsettlement produced by the First World War. The patterns of the past have been shattered for him by the dynamics of this war. It's also important to understand that the people who agreed with Wilson's diagnosis agreed with his prescription, that we needed an Article 10-like commitment. Here is, for example, the former President William Howard Taft, who played such a key role in the League to Enforce the Peace organization at the time, arguing for Article 10 in the Covenant. You can see here in this letter to the then Secretary of War, we now call this Department Secretary, the Department of Defense. The name might become less appropriate going forward with this administration, but we'll see. Where he basically says that Wilson's rationale is, to him, on point. And it's precisely this uncertainty about the runaway escalation trajectories of the future wars that moves him to support Wilson's proposal for Article 10. But for those people in the establishment who disagreed with Wilson's diagnosis, that disagreement was a core reason for the rejection of Article 10 also. This is Senator Elijah Root, a core figure in the Republican establishment, who eventually ended up swaying the moderates in the Senate to vote with the irreconcilables like Bora against Article 10. And Root here says, I do see a risk of runaway escalation, but it's limited. It's limited spatially to Eastern Europe, and it's limited temporally to the immediate post-war years. So what's the point of a boundless universal commitment? I'm happy to make a limited commitment, but not a boundless commitment. When Wilson comes to Paris, he finds himself almost completely isolated because everyone at Paris is opposed to an Article 10 non-aggression commitment. Why? They don't want to assume the sovereignty costs. They don't want to forgo the right of war. And they're very explicit about this point. Today, in the histories that overlook the problem of indeterminacy, and in the political science studies of this episode, we almost get the narrative that everyone in Paris converged on a particular vision of how to reconstruct the international system. That was not at all the case. Here's a conversation between Bob Cecil, who was, of course, the key mover of British internationalism in Paris, with Wilson's confidant, Edward House, where Cecil says, I'm perfectly willing to accept some limitations, like a cooling off period, but to forgo the right of war, especially over matters that involve national honor, is unthinkable. We will not go that far. This is absolutely key. Cecil, in a couple of years, will become a prophet of the Wilsonian vision. But he's not that here. He's a cynic here at the moment. Take a look at this. Realizing that Wilson is immovable, that Wilson doesn't want to budge on Article 10, for him it's the cornerstone of the whole covenant, Cecil decides to basically get his own way, to get people to sign up to Article 10 and then neuter it by disconnecting it from all of the sanctions articles in the covenant, like Article 16 especially. And so he starts playing this game of the consummate cynic, persuading the president to drop the article, but in the secret meetings with the British imperial delegation, arguing for the article, using Wilson's own justification. The very first time we see Cecil using this justification for an Article 10-led commitment is after his conversations with Wilson. And this is exactly what he says. This mutual interest in non-aggression is motivated by uncertainty about the origins of runaway escalation trajectory disputes. What's interesting about Cecil, ladies and gentlemen, is that a couple of years later, as I said, he converts to Woodrow Wilson's vision. From a cynic, he becomes a prophet. And there is a documentary trail explaining the conversion, which speaks exactly to the theory that I put before you. It's in 1922, in the beginning of 1922, that he writes to Léon Bourgeois, a key figure in the French peace movement, who was also with him at Paris, arguing that there is a need for a new kind of a security system. He says, Article 10 doesn't quite give you everything that you want. It falls a little bit short. Cecil should know he is the one who neutered it behind the scenes. But now he approaches Bourgeois and says, I have an idea for a new type of a commitment. For people who think that the covenant already accomplished all of that, who think that there was a kind of a harmonization of a vision for prohibiting war in Paris, this document would make no sense. But this is Cecil clearly saying, we all know the covenant is bunk when it comes to non-aggression. We need the real thing now. And at the meeting of what's called somewhat infelicitously the temporary mixed commission, the commission of civilian experts of the League charged with considering disarmament matters, Cecil's proposal is discussed. And the reaction shows you unequivocally that everyone understood at the time that the covenant was bunk when it came to Article 10. Lord Roberts' system amounts, in fact, to a declaration that war no longer legitimately exists. And so the committee breaks down into this disagreement, and Cecil, in order to motivate support for his proposal, he writes this memorandum, this extraordinary document, The Right of War and the Treaty of Mutual Guarantee, explaining his own conversion and trying to persuade the commission to come on board with him, where he basically makes Wilson's point. Take a look at this. New wars in the future will inevitably be more terrible than any that have occurred hitherto, and will almost inevitably become general. Again, take a careful look at the language here. He's not saying that every war is going to have this quality. What he's saying is there is now a tendency, this tendency for runaway amplification, and we cannot say which wars are going to explode in that way and which ones won't. But it is this danger that means that any price must be paid for preventing the outbreak of all wars, therefore. And that rationale he keeps repeating, both in private memoranda, confidential memoranda, as well as public speeches. Here is, for example, a note that he composes for the Committee for Imperial Defense, justifying this new entanglement. There can be no doubt that in another world war would lie the greatest danger to which the security and maintenance of the British Empire could be exposed. There is no longer a counterbalancing advantage for us. Honor, national honor, is no longer enough to motivate Cecil to retain the right of war when the risk of runaway escalation feels to him so real. makes the point again. This is a very illustrative letter that he writes to the 11th Marquis of Lothian, Philip Kerr, later ambassador to the United States under Churchill in the first years of the Second World War, making the same point exactly. It is our direct interest to stamp out war wherever it arises, at least in Europe, probably in Asia. As I see things, it is impossible to say what wars will spread and what wars will not. The motivation is laid bare for everyone to see in these letters. So with this evidence, let me just wrap up and quickly give you the core conclusions of the project and then open it up. The key conceptual contribution of the project is that it documents the use of multilateral prohibitions on militarized bargaining. There's a comprehensive history here and a comprehensive documentation of the patterns of use over time. The key empirical finding is that policymakers across different contexts have all independently converged on this logic of using prohibitions to manage the risk of runaway escalation, whether it's the arch-conservative Clemens von Metternich, or the old Bolshevik Maxim Litvinov, or it's the progressive Woodrow Wilson, or the imperialist Robert Cecil. They all share this mutual understanding. And the key policy implication is that we can use these prohibitions on militarized bargaining today in order to put limits to the risk of entanglement in conflicts characterized by a runaway escalation trajectory. The disputes in Ukraine and the Middle East especially are plausible contenders for the use of these instruments. And I would make the case to you, ladies and gentlemen, that incorporating them in the settlements concluding those disputes is an almost inevitable precondition for stabilizing those regions. Thank you very much.